Hi guys, I hope that you're doing well in quarantine. Um, so today we're going to talk about evolution. We're going to review natural selection and talk about different types of selection. We're also going to talk about different types of evolution, convergent and divergent evolution. This picture here, you can see, shows the evolution of different characters. But keep in mind this is different than evolution in real organisms because evolution in real organisms involves natural selection. So like on the picture, in the picture on the previous slide, evolution is change over time. However, in real organisms, it occurs through natural selection. So it occurs over many generations, and it's also the process by which modern organisms descended from ancient organisms, again, over a lot of time and many generations. We're going to talk about that a little bit today. We'll talk about the history of the Earth more in future weeks as well. So first off, let's review the requirements of natural selection. So the first is heritable variation. The second is overproduction of offspring. So that's when there's more offspring produced than the environment can support. The third is the struggle for survival. And then the fourth is differential survival and reproduction. So looking a little bit more in depth at the mechanisms for natural selection. So the struggle for existence, that's kind of like the competition between the species to obtain food and living space, as well as like the competition to avoid predators, or the struggle to avoid predators. The struggle to do well in maybe extreme environments as well. So then the second part of the mechanism is variation and adaptation. So variation, that's that heritable variation that we talked about. There's going to be natural variation inside of the species. Some of the variations are then going to make an organism more likely to survive and reproduce, and those variations that are beneficial are called adaptations. And so then lastly, the organisms that are best adapted to the environment are considered to have high fitness, because they're going to be more likely to survive and reproduce in the environment. And then they're going to be more likely to survive, and they're going to pass on their traits. So again, an adaptation is a trait that increases an individual's chance of survival and reproduction, and that's in a specific environment. So on one island, a trait such as maybe a long beak for a bird could be beneficial because it helps them eat the seeds that are on that island, but on another island that wouldn't be an adaptation because those seeds are not there. So we're going to look at some examples of adaptations. The first one is the structural adaptation of tortoise shell shapes in Galapagos tortoises. So these are tortoises that were on the islands that Darwin spent a lot of time studying and made a lot of his conclusions about natural selection based on. So here we have the saddleback tortoise. So the shape of this tortoise's shell allows it to kind of stretch up and eat or get fluid from a cactus, or and then this other tortoise, which is which eats different food, and its food sources are closer to the ground, has a dome-shaped shell. So you can see how both of these tortoises are structurally adapted to their ecological niche, to their food source, but they have different adaptations. Okay, so looking at more adaptations and some of the other types of adaptations, the first one we have is camouflage, with the example of the peppered moth, which is an organism that's often used to talk about as kind of a classic example for natural selection. During the Industrial Revolution, a lot of the trees were covered with black soot. And so because of that, the black peppered moths, which you can see here, were much better camouflaged. And so more of the white peppered moths were eaten, resulting in a higher frequency of the black peppered moths in the population and in the species. So then we also have mimicry, which is when something looks like something else that's dangerous. So in this example here, the scarlet king snake is not venomous, but it has very similar coloring to the coral snake, which is venomous. So you can see both of these snakes have red, black, and yellow stripes, but only the one snake is venomous, the other one is not. But then because of that, if a predator knows not to eat the venomous snake, they're also going to be less likely to eat the non-venomous snake that looks like the venomous snake. So another type of adaptation is a behavioral adaptation. So some examples are possums playing dead in order to not be bothered by predators. Wolf packs are going to be more able to find and hunt for food as a pack. Migration of animals is a behavioral adaptation. It allows animals to find food when there's no longer food in, say, a habitat where it's winter. And then hibernation is going to also be a behavioral adaptation that hibernation lowers the rate of metabolism, which allows organisms to not have to eat as much during the winter when there's not as much food available. Okay, so we've already talked about this, but I just want to reiterate and highlight a few things from this slide. So individuals that have low fitness or not well suited for their environment, again, that's for their environment, are going to be more likely to either die early or leave few offspring or both. Individuals then that are well suited for the environment are going to survive and reproduce more. They're going to be more likely to survive and reproduce. And then overall, over time, that population is going to increase in fitness because, again, the individuals that have that higher fitness, that have more of those adaptations, are going to be surviving and reproducing more often. So then there's going to be more individuals with those traits in the population. Okay, and so then this is really important, this last point. Natural selection is not working towards perfect, but it's working towards better suited for the given environment. So adaptations in one environment might look different, are probably going to look different than in a different environment. Okay, so here is a little animation showing natural selection. So we have some crows eating beetles. You can see that maybe they're seeing the green beetles easier, but so it's easier for them to eat the green beetles. They're eating more of the green beetles, and then over time, the brown beetles are flourishing and the green beetles are dying off. Okay, so we see here continuous variation in a phenotype. We're going to look at what some of the different types of selection do to this distribution, how they change this distribution. Yeah. Okay, so first we're going to talk about directional selection. So you can see on the left here, we have the original distribution of the population for the trait of beak size. So it shows, this key says that high mortality and low fitness is blue, and then low mortality, high fitness is yellow. So if we go back to the peak over here, we can see that larger beak sizes have a higher fitness. So then because of that, the population shifts towards having a larger beak size. So you can see this dashed curve here. The dashed line is the old curve, and then the solid line is the new curve, or the new distribution of the population. Yeah, so kind of the main thing here is directional selection is a shift towards the extreme of a trait. So it could have been a shift towards the smaller beak size, but in this case it's a shift towards the larger beak size. Okay, so then we have stabilizing selection. So stabilizing selection occurs when the extremes are selected against. So here we have the coloration of snails, and the light snails and the dark snails don't do as well. But the mid-color snails have higher fitness, they're more likely to survive and reproduce. So because of that, the curve you can see is narrower after selection occurs. Yeah, so also that during stabilizing selection, the average is going to stay the same, but the number of individuals with the intermediate trait increases, and the number of individuals with the extremes of the trait decreases. Okay, so next we have disruptive selection. So disruptive selection is basically when it's the opposite of stabilizing selection. It's when the intermediate forms of a trait are selected against. So here we have, again, snail coloration or snail banding pattern, but this time the middle of the trait is what is selected against. So individuals with the middle banding pattern are more likely to die, less likely to survive and reproduce, which results in an increase in the extremes and also kind of a split in the population. So you see this gap here after a lot of time has passed as the population splits in half. Okay, so now we're getting into a little bit more of the big picture of evolution. So over a lot of time and a lot of generations, organisms develop different structures, and they can develop the ability to live in different areas. So this process is called descent with modification. And descent with modification implies that life in the future is going to continue to diverge, and it also implies that if we look into the past, there was a common ancestor for all living things. And that's where the term common descent comes from. So all organisms have a common descent from a common ancestor. Okay, so then looking at some different types of evolution. So some species that are really closely related, so if you think about like Darwin's finches are a good example of this, they are actually closely related, but natural selection in different environments makes them become and look more and more different. So this is called adaptive radiation or divergent evolution. So adaptive radiation kind of, if you think about the finches, there is kind of one finch originally, one common ancestor, and then all of these different species that kind of radiate from that common ancestor that adapted for each of the slightly different environments. And then it's also called divergent evolution because the species are becoming increasingly different. So then kind of the opposite of that is that we have some species that are not closely related, but similar environments can make them look the same. So this is called convergent evolution because they're kind of converging, they're appearing more similar. Yeah. Okay, so looking then at some of the different types of structures that correspond to these different types of evolution. So for divergent evolution, we have homologous structures. So homologous body structures are structures that are shared by related species and that were inherited from a common ancestor. So remember, homo means same. So these structures they're kind of the same structures, they have the same basis, but they have evolved to become different. They've diverged from each other and now have different functions or slightly different functions. Yeah. So again, these develop through divergent evolution and adaptive radiation. So this picture we have here shows the common ancestor is the ancient lobe-finned fish that we have down at the bottom. We have the fin down at the bottom. And then this fin, through adaptive radiation, has, in a horse, over time evolved and changed to be like the horse's leg or the horse's hoof. In a chicken, it's the chicken's wing. We have here the alligator, the reptiles, arm and like, well, not hand, but like paw or claw, I guess, not paw. And then we have a frog or an amphibian's leg. So also, a lot of times in these kind of diagrams, they color code the different bones. So you have like the blue, there's barely any blue in the ancient lobefish. It's kind of a small bone here. But then that blue is that same bone that then has changed into the front bone here, the hoof of the horse, the front part of the chicken wing, and so on. So you can look at how the bone structure has changed, but how kind of where those bones came from in the common ancestor. So here's another look at some of the same homologous structures. So we have bat wing here, dolphin fin. So something to kind of notice on this page is that these homologous structures are used for different things. So the bat wing is used for flying, right? And then the dolphin fin is for swimming. So even though they all came from that same common ancestor, and all of them are considered pennadactyl limbs, kind of small up there, they have different functions in the animals. Okay, so then analogous structures relate to convergent evolution. And these are kind of the opposite of homologous structures. So analogous structures are body parts that share a common function but not a common structure. So they don't come from a common ancestor. So this occurs when organisms with similar environments develop similar strategies of dealing with those environments. So again, here in this picture, we actually see the first part. The first 4 structures here are homologous structures. And then the fly wing down here, which actually has the same function as the bird wing, is not does not have the same structure, and so these are called analogous structures. Yeah. So kind of one way to think about analogous structures, convergent evolution, is kind of like this strategy is like a good idea for that environment. It works well, so like it makes sense that nature is going to do it again. So some really good examples we have here are some mammals that are really similar to marsupials. So mammals and marsupials are not very closely related. But if we look here, these are some very similar functioning animals. So we have like the anteater the mammal anteater has a like pointed snout to get into the anthill, and kind of similar, the marsupial anteater also kind of has a pointed nose. Yeah, and you can look at the rest of those if you want. Okay, so then also another example here is a fish and an orca whale. So you can see that they're kind of, obviously the orca whale is a lot bigger, but they're similarly shaped. Both of them have like front fins, dorsal fins, the tail in the back. So again, this shape is good for swimming. It's can't think of the word, but it's well suited for swimming through the water quickly, efficiently, easily. So these not very closely related animals have developed a similar strategy. So here's another slide looking at wings again. So the bat wing and the bird wing are again homologous structures, and the colors of the bones are showing homologous bones. And then we have the insect wing, which is not homologous, but it is analogous, and so it looks similar to the bird wing and the bat wing. Okay, so we're going to take a second here to look at whale evolution. So whale evolution starts with actually a common ancestor with the hippo. You can see the hippo here continued to evolve and branch off. Yeah. So then we have some presumably extinct organisms. Different stages here. So up at the top, these organisms have 4 legs, and then as time goes on, the legs start to kind of diminish. The organisms have smaller and smaller legs. Then we have and then finally we have whales down here. We have whales and dolphins, which have fins. We'll see in a minute, but they actually have some remnants of leg structures. So we saw on the previous slide that whales descended from an ancestor that walked on 4 legs. So whales actually still have leg bones that they no longer use. So these structures that were inherited from ancestors and were useful to those ancestors in the past that are no longer useful to the current organism are called vestigial structures. So over time, these structures lose a lot of their original function. So some examples are hip bones in dolphins, tailbones in people. Yeah, and we'll see on the next slide some more vestigial structures. Okay, so here we have some human vestigial structures. So wisdom teeth, for example, I think were left over from when our ancestors ate had a slightly different diet than we have now. I think an appendices are also remnants from when our ancestors had a different diet, and I believe appendices are from when the intestines were longer. So you can look at some of these other vestigial structures here. So this is the last slide for today. Let Mr. Baker or I know if you have any questions. Make sure that you turn in your notes. I hope that you have a good day in quarantine. Stay healthy and stay safe.